Good Tuesday afternoon, everybody. I'm meteorologist Tim Pandajis here with your tropical update. Today we're talking about Tropical Storm Nicole. Yesterday when we spoke, it was subtropical storm, meaning it's completed its transition from subtropical to tropical. It's contracted its strongest winds, now located closer to the center. Also, the convection has begun wrapping around the core of the system, giving it more of a symmetrical look, a symmetrical presentation on satellite imagery, which I'll show you in just a second. Today's Tuesday, November the 8th. 2022. All right, here's the season so far by the numbers. Now we've got Nicole, that's our 14th named storm of the season so far. 21 days left in the season, goes all the way to November 30th. And 87 years it's been since a hurricane has struck the Florida peninsula in November. Now I can hear it already. If you're watching from Florida, you say, wait a second, Tim. Back in 1985, there was a storm that hit Florida. Yeah, that was Kate that hit the panhandle of Florida. We're talking 1935, 87 years ago, the last time that the peninsula itself was struck by a hurricane in the month of November. It's been a long time, and it looks like Nicole will make it to hurricane status as it bears down on the east coast of Florida in the next 36 to 48 hours. All right, let's talk about satellite presentation now. Yesterday when we spoke, I talked about how subtropical storms take on that shrimp-like appearance on satellite. A 24-hour loop here shows that appearance earlier on, and then notice how it begins and then ends that transition over to a tropical storm as the convection begins to wrap around that core. And we can't see it here, but the strongest of the winds are contracting and getting closer to that center. With subtropical storms, you find the strongest of the winds dislocated most times to the north-northeast of that center. Now they're closer to the center or the core of Nicole at the current time. Now on water vapor imagery, this depicts the dry air with the rust color to moist air that's in the different various shades of blue. We've got dry air that's wrapping on into the south and then getting pulled into the system here. And that's a little bit more obvious here on visible satellite imagery, which is also the more impressive imagery of Nicole at this time. But you can see this dry socket here getting pulled into the general circulation. Now, even though it's still intensifying, that dry air could choke things off and help it to plateau a little bit, halting its strengthening for a little while. But we're up to 60-mile-per-hour winds on this storm now, moving to the west at 9 miles per hour. And you can certainly see that fetch of tropical moisture and the wind field headed towards the east coast of Florida and the coast of Georgia here in the next 24 to 36 hours. Right now, the wind field, as of the latest NOAA advisory here from the National Weather Service, National Hurricane Center, puts the wind field stretching out from the northwest of the center of tropical storm force winds 330 miles to the southeast, stretches out 240. So we're talking about a 570-mile diameter wind field that you would find tropical storm force winds with Nicole at this time. Now, out ahead of it, all watches have mainly been upgraded to warnings. Out in the Bahamas, along the coast of Florida, hurricane warnings up and tropical storm warnings and watches farther to the north and farther to the south. This will likely be the area in the central eastern coast of Florida that sees the highest impacts from this, with storm surge, winds, and rain. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has already issued 34 counties to be under a state of emergency. If you can't see this too well, I do have this posted on my Twitter page if you want to get a better look of all the counties that are under that state of emergency declaration. Now, there are other watches and warnings up, storm surge related. Storm surge warnings now up for pretty much the entire east coast of Florida, stretching up into Georgia. Even on the west coast of Florida, north of Tampa, storm surge watches, because once the storm moves over land, we'll start to see the winds turn back around coming off the Gulf of Mexico, blowing onshore in these areas. They could see 2, 3, 4 foot storm surge values. Meanwhile, on the east coast, up to 5 feet is expected. This is amplified because we've got a full moon. Higher than normal astronomical tides. A king tide will impact those areas a little bit more at high tide cycles. When are those? We'll start things off with Wednesday night with forecast high tides in various locations along the east coast of Florida, most falling after the 8 o'clock hour in the evening. I think this high tide cycle, Thursday morning's high tide cycle, will be the period that you'll see the greatest rise in waters along the coastal areas thanks to this onshore fetch of winds as the pressure gradient with high pressure over New England and building Nicole to the south squeezes out winds, funneling them in from the east to the west onshore for a prolonged period of time. And as the storm gets deeper, the area of high pressure doesn't move anywhere. We'll see those winds pick up speed as we go forward in the next 24 to 36 hours ahead of landfall. So here's the updated Forecast cone from the National Hurricane Center here. It does take a jog to the southwest in the next 12 hours or so, strengthens to a high-end tropical storm, 70-mile-per-hour winds by tomorrow morning, and then up to a Category 1 storm as it moves over the northern Bahamas here Wednesday evening at 75 miles per hour. Takes a turn to the north and west and then heads towards Cape Canaveral area here, maybe even making landfall as far north as Daytona Beach. Models have been trending it a little bit farther to the north here, and that inbound trajectory of where it makes landfall has an impact. If it was coming dead on from east to west, it would have widespread impacts in terms of increased storm surge values. The winds will be spread out a little bit more, so storm surge may not be as bad farther to the north of that landfall location. Regardless, we're looking at widespread impacts here. Then it's over land 6 p.m. Thursday down to 45-mile-per-hour tropical storm. Now, if you remember back a few days, this was expected to go farther to the west and emerge over the Gulf of Mexico and potentially re-intensify before making a secondary landfall in the Big Bend area of Florida. That no longer looks to be a likely scenario. It's still not out of the realm of possibility, but it's not likely at this time. Takes a turn north and then gets swept up by an incoming cold front, picks up forward speed, and lifts fast through the Carolinas and the Virginias and eventually through the Mid-Atlantic and even in New England by the end of this week and into the weekend. So the forecast wind field here, this is what I really want to drive home. You're going to see here also the forecast cone. Impacts will be felt well outside of the forecast cone. The cone here only stretches from Daytona Beach to Fort Lauderdale, but look at how far out you can get tropical storm force winds stretching all the way north to Charleston, South Carolina by the time it's making landfall. So widespread wind impacts, that wind coming onshore, so that's why storm surge value is expected to go as high north as Savannah and even over towards Charleston at a couple foot above ground level as it makes landfall. Now, the likelihood of seeing at least tropical storm force winds, pretty much a guarantee. Of course, the closer you get to the center, those winds will be a little bit stronger. But probabilities now up to 80-90% chances closer to the landfall location, Melbourne area, Cape Canaveral. Computer models here have been pretty consistent. We're seeing a clustering of our spaghetti models, moving it off to the west-southwest, right in line with the cone that the Hurricane Center put out, and then it takes that turn north, gets swept up by the front, and rockets up through the Carolinas and even into southern New England by this weekend. Let's look at it here on Future Track. Now, this is not going to be a massive rainmaker. It's really going to be a widespread wind event, coastal erosion, rip currents, and storm surge as well. Watch as it plays out here as we go through the next 48 hours or so. Here we are tomorrow, early afternoon, early evening, as the center of what will likely be Hurricane Nicole at this point moves over the northern Bahamas. You can see that wind field here drawing winds from the northeast to the southwest, north of the center. And then this particular model does bring it in just south of Daytona Beach, right around Cape Canaveral here. The onshore winds anywhere north of that landfall location will have the big-time storm surge values of up to 5 feet. South of there, notice the wind direction is coming offshore. So it's actually going to be blowing the ocean away from the coastline, and we won't be seeing those issues in terms of storm surge values south of that center. Now, as it moves inland too, I talked about the west coast of Florida also seeing some storm surge problems. There's that wind blowing onshore north of Tampa as we get into Thursday early in the morning. It lifts inland, heads into North Florida, South Georgia, still raining itself out, losing its wind component a little bit, and then it gets swept up to the north with that inbound cold front from the northwest. Rainfall totals, I said it's not going to be that big of a rainmaker. 1, 2, 3, maybe locally 4 or 5 inches. There could be some localized areas of flash flooding and some of the heaviest of the downpours, but overall this is not nearly as impressive as the rainfall that we saw with Hurricane Ian a month and a half ago. And then the rainfall stretches all the way north along the spine of the Appalachians, up into New York and into New England and the Northeast as we go through the weekend. So this looks to be a rainmaker for the entire eastern seaboard going forward. So my final thoughts here with our current outlook: Nicole now likely entering a period of intensification as it's headed towards Florida. Impacts will be felt well outside the forecast cone, as you saw, with that ginormous wind field that'll be developing and expanding in coverage as we head forward in time. And it's not just Florida that will see impacts, but all of the eastern seaboard. You saw that with rainfall totals, and especially along the spine of the Appalachians. That moisture running up against the mountains helps to kind of pull all the moisture out of the clouds, and we see higher rainfall totals there, and flash flooding could be a problem. So we're not just going to keep our eyes on Florida, but the entire eastern seaboard. All right, that's the latest with Nicole there. Now a tropical storm expected to become a hurricane. Until next time, you can find me on all the social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and also on TikTok at Tim Talk Weather. We'll talk again tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.